Millionaire pretended to be Janitor to test Maid until he saw her do this with his autistic son. Daniel Harper, the silver-haired man who quietly swept leaves in the garden every morning, was, in fact, the owner of the seaside mansion. 3 years earlier, after the sudden death of his wife, Elena, Daniel had vanished from the world of music. He left the university, abandoned his concerts, and bought an old mansion standing silently by the coast of Maine. There, surrounded only by the sound of wind and waves, he lived with his young son Ethan, a 7-year-old boy with autism who relied on a wheelchair. Since Elena's passing, Ethan had withdrawn completely. He rarely spoke, feared loud noises, and couldn't express emotions through words. Caregivers came and went, each one eventually saying the same things. "He's too difficult. He doesn't cooperate. There's no hope." Each time that happened, Daniel closed himself off even more. He no longer trusted anyone but himself. One morning, after a sleepless night spent by the window listening to rain on the roof, Daniel told himself, "If I can't trust anyone, then I'll have to test them myself." He decided to hire a new housekeeper, but without telling anyone in the mansion who he really was. From that day on, everyone only knew Mr. Cole, a quiet man in an old jacket who always carried a toolbox. They all thought he was just a caretaker, a man who came to work and would eventually leave like all the others. But for Daniel, it was a role he felt compelled to play. He wanted to see with his own eyes whether someone would come to this house truly for Ethan or only for the generous paycheck. That morning, a thick fog covered the winding path leading up the hill where the Harper Villa stood, facing the endless sea. The sound of waves mixed with distant seagulls, like the overture to a new story waiting to begin. Grace Miller pulled her small suitcase behind her. She stopped before the tall iron gate, taking a deep breath. The salty air carried a chill that brushed against her skin, but her eyes remained bright, full of quiet determination and a hint of nervous hope. Grace wasn't rich or remarkable. She was a senior student majoring in music therapy, juggling part-time jobs to pay for school. She believed in the power of sound, that music could reach places where words could not. When the intercom buzzed, a woman's voice answered, and the gates slowly opened. The stone path led her through a garden lined with sea daisies still covered in dew. The mansion appeared, elegant yet cold, as if time had stopped moving inside its walls. The wooden door opened. A tall, thin woman stood waiting. Mrs. Whitmore, the longtime housekeeper. Her face was stern, but her eyes carried a trace of warmth. "You must be Miss Miller," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Grace replied softly. Mrs. Whitmore guided her through the grand hall. Their footsteps echoed on the marble floor. The walls were lined with framed scores, old portraits, and a covered piano. Everything looked beautiful, but lifeless. In the sitting room, the interview was brief. Mrs. Whitmore asked about Grace's experience with children who had special needs. Grace didn't exaggerate. She spoke quietly about teaching music to a deaf girl once and how she believed sound wasn't just to be heard. It was something you could feel with your heart. Mrs. Whitmore nodded slowly. "The boy here doesn't talk," she said. "He doesn't like to be touched. He frightens easily. Do you still wish to take the job?" Grace smiled gently. "Yes, ma'am. I believe everyone has their own language. I just need to learn how to listen." In the corner of the room, Mr. Cole, the handyman Daniel pretended to be, was adjusting a socket but listening carefully to every word. His eyes lingered on Grace's face. There was no fake confidence there, only quiet sincerity. After the interview, Mrs. Whitmore gave Grace a short tour of the house. They passed the kitchen, the laundry room, then climbed the long staircase to the hallway where Ethan's room was. Light filtered softly through the curtains, painting thin lines across the polished floor. The silence was almost complete. Mrs. Whitmore spoke in a lower tone. "The boy's mother passed long ago. Mr. Harper hasn't been the same since. This house hasn't known laughter for years. Grace said nothing. She understood this job wasn't just about cleaning or caregiving. She was stepping into the remains of a broken family, into a home where music once filled the rooms but had long fallen silent. As she left that evening, Grace turned back for one last look. The sunset glowed against the windows, and through the garden she could see a man standing quietly with a broom in hand. Mr. Cole, watching her as she walked away. The next morning, the mansion was so quiet that Daniel could hear the waves crashing against the distant cliffs. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows, glinting off old framed portraits faded by time. Down the first-floor corridor, Mr. Cole, or rather Daniel Harper, held a rag in his hand, pretending to wipe the window frame, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the staircase where Grace Miller was coming down. She wore the simple uniform Mrs. Whitmore had given her the day before. Her hair was neatly tied, her expression calm, yet curious. Daniel watched her closely, not as an employer, but as a man trying to understand a quiet mystery. All morning, Grace worked under Mrs. Whitmore's guidance, dusting the parlor, polishing the old piano, rearranging books on the shelves. Daniel lingered nearby, pretending to fix a ceiling light, but never truly looking away. He noticed how gently she moved, never in a hurry. When she reached the piano, she paused, running her fingers lightly across the closed lid as if afraid to disturb the silence sleeping inside. The sight stirred something painful and familiar. Elena had once sat at that same piano, her hands flowing over the keys on windy afternoons. Watching Grace there was like watching a shadow of the past. At lunch, while Grace sat with the kitchen staff, Daniel took a seat by the door, pretending to repair an old outlet. He overheard her ask the cook, "Does the boy like sounds?" The cook, Mr. Baker, shrugged. "Like them? I don't know. He just spins his toy and says nothing." Grace didn't seem discouraged. She smiled softly. "Maybe he hears them. He just hasn't found his way to answer yet." Daniel froze for a moment. He had never thought of Ethan that way. To him, his son's silence was a locked door, but to Grace it was simply a door that hadn't been knocked on the right way. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore asked Grace to prepare Ethan's room. Daniel stayed nearby, pretending to sweep the hall, listening to every sound. He heard her quietly arranging pillows, her gentle voice asking, "Do you like blue or white better, Ethan?" Followed by silence, a silence she didn't seem afraid of. When she stepped out, Daniel found himself speaking without thinking. "You're patient," he said. Grace looked surprised, then smiled. "I think everyone deserves gentleness, especially those who can't say how they feel." Daniel didn't answer, only nodded. But inside him, something shifted, a forgotten melody touched by someone's unknowing hand. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Daniel sat alone in his study. He opened an old notebook filled with half-written compositions, abandoned years ago after Elena's death. Beneath the faded notes, he added a single line. "She's different, doesn't try to impress, just listens." Outside, the sea whispered against the rocks, and in the quiet of that night, a man who had long stopped believing began, for the first time in years, to want to believe again. The next morning, the house was as quiet as ever, only the sound of the sea breeze slipping through the window cracks and the steady ticking of the clock. Grace climbed the stairs, holding a small notebook and a few colored pencils. Mrs. Whitmore walked beside her, speaking softly. "Today, you don't have to do much," she said. "Just watch him. Don't get too close. He doesn't like being touched, and he probably won't look at you." Grace nodded. She knew she was about to step into another world, one where every sound, glance, and breath could make the boy retreat. When the door opened, Ethan Harper was sitting by the window. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, painting faint streaks across his hair. In his hands, he spun a small red wheel, again and again, as if that rhythm was the only thing that kept him safe. Mrs. Whitmore placed a hand on Grace's shoulder. "I'll leave you here. Don't expect a reaction. Just let him get used to you." The door closed. The room was filled only with the soft hum of the toy and the distant sound of waves. Grace stood still for a few seconds, then slowly sat on the floor, keeping a gentle distance. She opened her notebook, took out the pencils, and began to draw. She didn't look at the boy directly, only glanced from the corner of her eye. She drew a little house, a row of trees, a sun in the corner of the page. Her hand moved slowly, rhythmically, as if she were singing with colors. After a while, she began to hum, a wordless tune, quiet, warm, and steady. Ethan didn't react. He kept spinning the wheel, but Grace didn't stop. She kept drawing, kept humming, letting the sound fill the room like a breath. Time passed gently. As the light outside shifted, Grace noticed the spinning had stopped. Ethan's head tilted slightly, not toward her, but enough to show he was listening. Grace turned the page and drew a small toy that looked like his. She didn't speak, just placed the sketch where he could see it. A minute passed, then 2. Ethan didn't look away. He didn't smile or move, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer cold. Outside, Daniel, still disguised as Mr. Cole, was wiping the hall floor. Through the narrow crack of the door, he saw Grace sitting cross-legged on the carpet, drawing, humming softly, never forcing, never rushing. And Ethan, quiet, still, yet calm. Daniel froze. Everyone before had tried to fix his son. They spoke loudly, waved toys, demanded reactions. But Grace didn't. She simply existed beside him, peaceful, unafraid, treating Ethan's silence not as a flaw, but as a language. For the first time in months, Daniel felt something shift in the air. The room no longer felt heavy. There was something fragile but real, like a thread being gently woven between two souls that had long forgotten how to reach out. When Grace stood up, she left the drawing on the floor. Ethan didn't turn his head, but his eyes lingered on the colorful paper. Outside the door, Daniel leaned quietly against the wall, eyes blurred with emotion. He understood. Something had begun, slow but deep, something he hadn't seen in years. Connection. A few days passed since Grace's first meeting with Ethan. No one in the house spoke of it, yet everyone noticed a quiet change. The boy no longer screamed when someone entered his room. And each morning, when Grace opened the door, Ethan would glance at her briefly before turning back to his toy, which to Grace felt like a greeting. One afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore asked Grace to tidy up the old music room downstairs, a place untouched for years. The room smelled of aged wood and sea salt, the kind of scent that carried memories. On the piano by the window sat a small, forgotten object, a wooden music box, coated in a thin layer of dust. Grace wiped it gently and noticed tiny carvings of petals along its edges. Beneath it, faint letters read, "For E.H." She turned the little key on its side. A melody began to play, light, clear, like rippling water. The notes were simple, delicate, and tinged with quiet sorrow. Grace stood still, listening all the way to the end. Something in that tune touched her deeply. She didn't know why, but she decided to bring the box upstairs to Ethan's room. The boy sat in his usual spot, spinning the red wheel in his hand. Grace sat down on the floor as always, placed the box on the table by the window, and gently wound it again. The melody filled the air, floating softly, warm and slow, like a lullaby. Ethan froze. The wheel in his hand stopped spinning. His eyes narrowed slightly, then lifted, turning toward the sound. Grace held her breath. She didn't speak. She let the music speak for her. Ethan reached forward, touched the lid, then leaned closer to listen. A long, fragile silence followed. And then he smiled. Not wide, not clear, but real. It was the first time Grace had ever seen that smile. Small, trembling, but alive. In the hallway, Daniel stood still. He had meant to pass by, but the familiar melody stopped him in his tracks. It was the lullaby Elena had sung to Ethan before he was born. He remembered every note, every pause. His whole body froze as memories washed over him like a wave. Through the narrow crack in the door, he saw Ethan sitting quietly, the box in his lap, and Grace watching him with calm, gentle eyes. No words were spoken, yet the room glowed with a kind of peace Daniel hadn't felt in years. He swallowed hard, turning away, pressing his back against the wall, eyes closed. The music played on behind him, each note tapping softly against the cracks in his heart. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Daniel returned to the music room. The piano stood there, dust wiped clean. He sat down, opened the lid, and placed his trembling hands on the keys. He couldn't play. Emotion held him still. He whispered under his breath, as if speaking to Elena. "You sent her, didn't you?" Outside, the sea kept its rhythm, the waves echoing the lullaby's fading tune. And in that quiet darkness, Daniel realized music had found its way back into this house, not through his hands, but through the heart of a young woman named Grace Miller. That night, the sky above the Maine coast broke into a furious storm. Thunder rolled across the sea like drums beating against the cliffs. Wind slammed the windows, rain hammered the old roof. The entire mansion trembled under nature's roar. Grace Miller was still awake, pouring herself a cup of tea, when a piercing scream echoed from upstairs. A sharp, terrified cry, followed by heavy, frantic banging. Her heart seized. She knew that sound. Ethan. Grace dropped the cup and ran. Rain had blown in through open windows, soaking the stairs as she climbed. In the hallway, 2 workers stood frozen outside Ethan's door, too afraid to go in. Inside, objects crashed and shattered, the boy's screams tearing through the storm. "He's having an episode," one whispered. Grace didn't hesitate. She pushed the door open. The room was chaos, curtains whipped in the wind. Ethan was curled up in his wheelchair, pounding the armrests, tears streaming down his red face. His breath came in sharp gasps, half sobs, half screams. "It's okay, Ethan," Grace said softly, voice trembling but steady. She took a slow step forward. He screamed louder, shaking his head, fists pounding harder. Grace knew, moved too fast, and he'd panic more. She inhaled deeply, then reached into her pocket. The music box. She turned the key gently. The familiar melody played, fragile but clear. Ethan didn't stop. Not yet. Grace knelt down in front of him, holding the box with one hand, reaching the other toward him. "Listen, Ethan," she whispered. "It's your song." Lightning flashed across the room. Thunder cracked. For a moment, their faces glowed in white light. 2 trembling figures caught between chaos and calm. Ethan struck the armrest again. The music box slipped from Grace's hand, hit the floor, and fell silent. Then he began hitting his head against the chair. Without thinking, Grace lunged forward and wrapped her arms around him. "It's okay. It's okay. I'm here," she whispered, voice breaking. He fought her, pushing, kicking, pulling her hair. But she didn't let go. Her arms tightened, shaking, but her words stayed soft. "I'm here, Ethan. You're safe. You're safe, sweetheart." In the doorway, Daniel Harper appeared, still in his janitor clothes, a broom in hand. He froze. He'd never seen anyone touch his son during a breakdown. No one dared. But Grace did. She wasn't afraid. Ethan thrashed once more, then stopped. His small body trembled, then relaxed. His breathing slowed. He looked up, eyes wet and wide. His lips moved. Grace froze. "What is it, Ethan?" she whispered, heart pounding. The boy swallowed hard. Then, in a hoarse, broken voice, he said a single word. "Music?" Grace gasped. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Yes, Ethan," she cried softly. "That's right. Music." In the doorway, Daniel dropped the broom. The wooden handle clattered loudly against the floor, echoing through the hall. His hand covered his mouth as tears flooded his eyes. He hadn't heard his son speak since the day Elena died. But now, in the arms of this gentle stranger, the boy had said one word, a word that tied past and present, loss and love, into one fragile moment. Music. When the storm quieted, Ethan fell asleep in Grace's arms, clutching the music box tightly. His breathing was calm, peaceful. Grace sat there for a long time, letting rain and tears mix on her skin. She looked down at the boy, smiling through her sobs, a trembling, hopeful smile. In the hall, Daniel remained motionless, tears streaming silently as he whispered, "Thank you." The storm passed that night, but inside the old seaside mansion, something new had begun. The awakening of a small soul, and with it, a father's heart slowly thawing after years of silence. The morning after the storm felt strangely fresh. Raindrops still clung to the window frames, catching the first light of day. Inside the seaside mansion, even the waves seemed gentler, as if the ocean itself had sighed in relief after the long night. Grace Miller entered Ethan's room. The boy was awake, sitting quietly in his wheelchair, his eyes still hazy with exhaustion. When he saw her, he smiled faintly, a small, fragile smile that made her heart tremble. "Good morning, Ethan," Grace said softly, carrying a breakfast tray. "I've got apple porridge and orange juice. Would you like some?" He didn't speak, only nodded slightly. Grace scooped a spoonful and held it up. For the first time since she'd arrived, Ethan didn't turn away. He opened his mouth and ate slowly. Between bites, Grace made funny faces, exaggerating her expressions until Ethan giggled, a brief, pure sound, but real. That was the moment Daniel, still in his Mr. Cole disguise, witnessed while sweeping the far corner of the room. The sound of that laugh froze him in place. He looked up, heart tight with disbelief and tenderness. He hadn't heard that sound in years. As Grace wiped Ethan's mouth, the boy suddenly looked up and pointed at her. His voice was small but clearer than before. "I wish..." Grace paused, lowering the spoon. "What do you wish for, Ethan?" she asked gently. He looked at her, lips trembling. After a few seconds, he finished his sentence. "I wish you're my mommy." Time stopped. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She didn't know what to say. She smiled through the ache, placing her hand over his small, shaking one. "You already have a wonderful mommy, Ethan," she whispered, voice breaking. "I'm just here to love you a little more." Ethan didn't understand all her words, but his smile said he felt them. Behind them, Daniel lowered his head. The broom slipped from his hand, the soft clatter echoing in the quiet room. He turned away, tears burning his eyes. That innocent wish pierced through every wall he had built to protect himself from pain. He walked outside into the garden. The morning breeze carried the scent of salt and pine. He sat on the old wooden bench where Elena once read her books. In his mind, he could still hear her lullaby, the one she used to sing for Ethan before he was born, now blending with the sound of his son's laughter. It didn't hurt anymore. It was warm, tender, alive. He whispered to the wind, "Do you see, Elena? He's laughing again." At the window upstairs, Grace and Ethan looked out toward the sea. The boy lifted his hand, pointing at the sunlight dancing across the waves. Grace nodded and murmured, "Yes, Ethan, the light is beautiful, isn't it?" He nodded softly, and in that quiet, wordless moment, they both knew that child's wish, simple and pure, had healed something deep that no adult words ever could. The following days passed quietly. The once silent mansion now carried the sounds of life. Soft laughter, faint music drifting from Ethan's room, and the steady footsteps of Mr. Cole, who always seemed nearby, silently observing, but rarely speaking. Grace could feel it. Someone in this house was always watching her. Not in a suspicious way, but with quiet respect. She didn't mind. She thought Mr. Cole was simply a kind man who understood loneliness better than most. One late afternoon, while cleaning the study, a room misses. Whitmore seldom allowed anyone to enter. Grace accidentally knocked a few books off a shelf. When she bent down to pick them up, something caught her eye behind the row of volumes. A dusty picture frame. She pulled it out. Inside was a family photograph, a woman with golden hair and a gentle smile. Clearly Elena, standing beside a younger man in a dark suit, his gaze calm and confident. In his arms was a laughing baby. Ethan, just an infant. Grace froze. Her heart thudded painfully as she realized the man in the picture was Mr. Cole. She stared, unable to deny it. The eyes, the smile. Older now, yes, but unmistakable. Her hands trembled around the frame. Memories aligned in her mind, the way he spoke to Mrs. Whitmore with quiet authority, how the staff lowered their eyes when he walked by, the warmth in his gaze whenever he looked at Ethan. Grace took a step back, clutching the photo to her chest. That night, she found him in the hallway near the music room. Daniel, still in his janitor disguise, was wiping the window. When he saw her approach, he looked up and smiled faintly out of habit. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. Grace didn't answer. She simply held out the photograph. "You're not just the janitor, are you?" The air froze. Daniel stopped moving, looked at the frame, then at her. He knew the truth could no longer hide. He took a slow breath. "No," he said quietly. "I'm not." Silence. The distant crash of waves echoed through the corridor. Daniel leaned against the wall, his voice rough. "I'm Daniel Harper, Ethan's father, the owner of this house, and the man who's been watching you since the day you arrived." Grace stood still. Her expression shifted from shock to quiet disappointment. "Why?" she whispered. Daniel lowered his head. "Because I stopped trusting people. Everyone left, Grace. They came for money, for status, never for my son. I just needed to know if you were different." His voice cracked at the end. He looked small, almost fragile. Grace was silent for a long time. Then she said softly, "You didn't have to test me, Daniel. I wasn't here for you. I was here for Ethan, for the music, because I believe he deserves real love." She placed the photo in his hands, her eyes glistening. "I think I need some time." Then she turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the long, dim corridor where the light cast soft golden lines across the floor. Daniel watched her go, eyes hollow. For the first time in years, he felt fear, not of loss, but of losing the one person who had made him believe again. That night, Daniel Harper didn't sleep. He sat in his study, staring at the photo of Elena on his desk. The candlelight flickered over his tired face, weary, regretful, yet filled with something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Not fear of being found out, but fear of losing the one person who had brought life back into his home. The next morning was bright. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and renewal. Daniel searched the house for Grace but couldn't find her. Near noon, he finally spotted her in the garden, sitting alone on the stone bench, notebook in hand, gazing quietly toward the ocean. He walked toward her, no longer wearing the janitor's disguise. It was just him now, Daniel Harper. Plain shirt, no mask, no pretense. "Grace," he called softly. She looked up, calm but distant, her eyes holding traces of hurt. He stopped a few steps away, afraid to move closer. "I owe you an apology," he began, voice low and trembling. "I was wrong. I let fear and mistrust drive me. I thought I could protect my son by controlling everything. But all I did was hurt someone else. Grace said nothing. She simply listened. He went on. When Elena died, I broke. I didn't know how to be a father. Not to a boy who wouldn't speak, who wouldn't look at me. Every person I hired left, leaving Ethan more afraid than before. I couldn't stand it anymore. So I hid. I thought pretending would help me see who was genuine. He paused, lowering his eyes. And you were. You gave him something even I couldn't. The wind carried the scent of freshly cut grass. Grace set her notebook down and met his gaze. I understand fear, Daniel, she said softly. But trust is also a kind of courage. If you want honesty from others, you have to start by being honest yourself. Daniel nodded, eyes glistening. I know, and I'm trying to learn that again. Not just to say sorry, but to believe again. Silence hung between them. Only the distant rhythm of waves filled the air. Finally, Grace exhaled, a faint smile curving her lips. Ethan needs you, Daniel, and maybe you need someone to remind you there's still music in life. He looked at her, hope flickering in his tired eyes. Will you stay? He asked quietly. Grace didn't answer right away. She turned toward the house where the boy sat by the window, holding the music box, gently rocking it as if humming along to an invisible tune. Then she looked back, her eyes soft. Only if you promise no more secrets. Daniel nodded instantly. No more secrets, Grace, not with you, not with him. Her smile brightened, warm as morning sunlight. Then I'll stay, not for the job, but because our song isn't finished yet. Daniel exhaled, the weight of years lifting from his chest. He sat beside her, and for the first time, there was no wall between them. Just two people learning again how to trust, how to love, how to begin. From the window, Ethan's laughter drifted toward them as the music box played its tender tune once more. And that melody, carried by the sea breeze, no longer belonged to sorrow. It belonged to healing. Time passed faster than anyone realized. Summer arrived, draping golden light across the stone steps of the seaside mansion where Ethan now often sat with Grace, his small hands holding the familiar music box. The house that was once a symbol of silence and loss now carried the sounds of life, the piano's gentle notes from the living room, Ethan's soft laughter each time he mastered a new melody, and the calm voice of Daniel Harper, no longer hiding behind any disguise. Every morning, Daniel and Grace took Ethan to the garden. The boy was no longer withdrawn. He could name objects, smile at songs, and sometimes even hum along, his voice fragile but pure as sunlight through mist. One afternoon, Grace taught Ethan to play a simple tune on the keyboard. The boy pressed each key carefully, his hands trembling slightly, his eyes focused. Daniel watched from the doorway, the golden sunset casting light over them, a sight so gentle it hurt in the sweetest way. When the short melody ended, imperfect yet sincere, Ethan turned to Grace, smiling. "Pretty song?" he said softly. Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, Ethan." "Beautiful?" From a distance, Daniel smiled. He knew the cracks in their home and in their hearts had been mended, not by miracles, but by patience and love. Months later, Grace opened a small class for children with autism in the town. Daniel helped her build a studio in the garden, a bright room facing the sea, where the morning light poured in and music drifted out every afternoon. Ethan was the first student and the heart of it all. People soon called it the House of Music. No one entered without smiling at the sound of the piano, and no one left without tears when they saw the boy who once couldn't speak now sitting at the keyboard, humming his own melody. One evening after class, Daniel and Grace sat on the porch. The night was still, the sea reflecting the moonlight. Inside, Ethan was drawing, occasionally whistling along with the tune from his old music box. Daniel turned to Grace. "I still don't understand why you stayed," he said, voice quiet but warm. Grace smiled at the horizon. "Because Ethan's song isn't finished," she said softly, "and I think we both need to hear the rest of it." Daniel nodded, eyes fixed on the glow from the room where his son sat. "Thank you, Grace, not just for him, but for bringing this place back to life." She looked at him, her expression tender. "No, Daniel, you brought it back. I just added a little melody." They sat side by side in silence. From inside, Ethan's piano began again, soft, imperfect, but alive. Daniel closed his eyes and listened. Each note touched something deep inside him, a place once hollow, now full. On the piano behind them sat a framed photo of 3 smiling faces: Daniel, Grace, and Ethan. Beside it lay the small music box, the same one that had started it all, the symbol of memory, healing, and love. Outside, the waves brushed gently against the shore. The house was no longer a shelter for grief. It had become a song, one that would never end, echoing through the walls, through the sea, and through every heart that once forgot how to listen.